Every single year, someone confidently predicts that Sydney property is about to crash. Every single year, they are almost always wrong. Sydney dips, Sydney corrects, but Sydney almost never truly crashes. Today we explain the real reason why, and what would actually have to happen for the predictions to finally come true. First, let's define our terms, because this matters. A correction is a fall of less than 10%, usually recovered within a year or two. A crash is a sustained fall of 20% or more that takes many years to recover from. Sydney has had plenty of corrections. It has had remarkably few genuine crashes. Understanding why requires looking past the headlines and into the actual mechanics of supply and demand. The single most important factor is land scarcity. Sydney is geographically trapped. To the east is the ocean. To the west are the Blue Mountains. To the north and south are national parks and protected land. Unlike a flat inland city that can sprawl endlessly in every direction, Sydney has hard physical limits on how much developable land exists near jobs and transport. When you cannot easily create new supply close to where people want to live, prices for the limited existing supply stay structurally high. This is the foundation everything else is built on. The second factor is demand, and Sydney's demand is extraordinary. Sydney is the primary destination for international migration into Australia. It is the country's financial capital, its largest job market, and the city most new arrivals target first. Every year, tens of thousands of new residents arrive needing somewhere to live. That relentless population pressure pushing against a physically constrained supply is the engine that keeps prices elevated. Even when demand softens temporarily, the long-term trend of more people wanting to live in a city that cannot easily expand is incredibly powerful. The third factor is the behavior of Sydney homeowners during downturns. Here is something most people do not understand. For a property market to truly crash, you need forced sellers. You need large numbers of people who absolutely must sell at any price, usually because they cannot afford their mortgage. In Sydney, the majority of homeowners have substantial equity built up over years of rising prices. When the market softens, most of them simply do not sell. They wait. They take the property off the market and hold until conditions improve. When sellers can choose to wait rather than being forced to dump, prices are sheltered from the kind of collapse that requires panic selling. This connects to the role of interest rates and lending standards. When the Reserve Bank raises rates, Sydney does feel it more than most cities, because Sydney has the largest average mortgage size in the country. Higher rates genuinely do soften Sydney prices. But Australian lending standards are strict. Banks stress test borrowers to make sure they can handle higher rates before approving loans. This means that even when rates rise sharply, most Sydney borrowers can still make their payments, painful as it may be. They tighten their budgets, they suffer, but they hold on. And holding on is exactly what prevents a crash. So if Sydney is this resilient, what would it actually take to make it crash for real? 3 things would need to happen at once. First, a sustained surge in unemployment, deep enough that large numbers of homeowners lose their income and cannot pay their mortgages. Second, a sudden collapse in migration, removing the demand pressure that underpins the market. Third, a credit event, where banks stop lending freely and buyers simply cannot get finance. If all 3 happen together, Sydney could genuinely crash. But that combination is rare. It is essentially a severe depression scenario, not a normal economic downturn. This is why the perennial crash predictions keep failing. The people predicting a Sydney crash are usually pointing at one factor, like high interest rates or stretched affordability, and assuming it is enough on its own. It almost never is. A single negative factor produces a correction. It takes a perfect storm of multiple severe factors hitting at once to produce a true crash, and that storm rarely arrives. none of this means Sydney is a guaranteed win or that prices only go up. Sydney can absolutely stagnate for years. It can correct 10% and frustrate buyers who time it badly. Affordability in Sydney is genuinely broken, and that creates real social problems and real risks. But stagnation and correction are very different from collapse. An investor who buys quality Sydney property and holds for 15 years has rarely lost money in real terms, even buying at what looked like a peak. So the takeaway is this. Stop waiting for the Great Sydney Crash that lets you buy at half price. History suggests it is probably not coming in the way you imagine. Sydney rewards patient buyers who accept they will never time the bottom perfectly, and who hold quality property through the inevitable corrections. The scarcity is real, the demand is relentless, and the homeowners are resilient. That is the supply and demand truth behind Australia's most stubborn property market. If you found this useful, hit subscribe, because we break down a different Australian property market every few days. See you in the next one. It is also worth understanding why the crash predictions are so emotionally appealing, because that helps you tune them out. Sydney property is so expensive that it feels morally wrong to many people. The idea that prices must surely collapse back to affordable levels is satisfying and intuitive. But markets do not move based on what feels fair. They move based on supply, demand, and the financial position of owners. The gap between what feels like it should happen and what the mechanics actually produce is exactly why so many people have waited on the sidelines for a crash that never came, watching prices climb further out of reach each year. Understanding the real drivers, rather than the emotionally satisfying story, is what separates investors who act from those who wait forever.